Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. My guest today is William J. Federer, a nationally known speaker, best-selling author, and president of Amerisearch Inc. His book, America's God and Country Encyclopedia of Quotations, has sold over 500,000 copies, and his American Minute features recalling events of American significance on the date they occurred is broadcast nationally on radio and television. They are also read by thousands via the internet. Bill Federer, welcome to Conversation.
Lee, great to be with you.
We're glad to have you back. I was surprised when I went and looked at our records that it had been, well over a year since we've seen you, so we're glad to have you here. And we're going to be doing a repeat of what we did a couple years ago, which is our your Christmas show, basically talking about the history of Christmas. So I'm just going to turn it over to you and start telling us this history.
Well, thank you, Lee. And I did a book. It's called "There Really Is a Santa Claus: The History of St. Nicholas and Christmas Holiday Traditions." Actually, have a brand new cover and have updated the book from this. But St. Nicholas is the most popular Greek Orthodox saint. And so they have lots of story and lots of history, and people in the West aren't familiar with that. And so St. Nicholas was born around 280 AD, which is during the Roman Empire period of time. And so there were 10 major persecutions of Christians during the first 300 years, and he lived during the last one. The story is that his parents were wealthy and elderly, and they died when a plague swept through their little town of Patara in Asia Minor, which is today Turkey. And he inherited a large amount of wealth, and his uncle encouraged him to go into the ministry. His uncle had been a minister. And so Nicholas would go down into the town and help the poor. And he would do it anonymously because he wanted the glory to go to God. And so there was a famous story where a merchant in town had gone bankrupt. And the creditors back then would not only come and take your house and your land, they would take your children. Pretty serious repo there. Anyway, so this merchant had 3 beautiful daughters. He knew if they were taken, it would probably mean a life of prostitution for them. The father had the idea of hurrying up and marrying his daughters off. Unfortunately, he did not have money for a dowry, which was needed in that area of the world for a legally recognized wedding. Well, Nicholas heard the problem late one night, threw some money in the window, and it landed by a shoe or a stocking that was drying by the fireplace. And it provided the dowry. The oldest daughter got married. It was a big buzz, talk of the town. He did it for the second daughter. When he threw the money in for the third daughter, the dad ran outside and caught him. And Nicholas made him promise not to tell where the money came from. Again, he wanted the glory to go to God. And so this was the origin of the tradition of secret gift giving on the anniversary of Nicholas's death, which was December 6th of 343 AD. Now, he went on to have quite an interesting life. He became the Bishop of Myra, which is a town on the coast in southwestern Turkey today. It's called Demre. But then there was the Diocletian, the emperor, who was arresting church leaders and killing them. And so this was the last of the 10 major persecutions, went on for 30 years, didn't end till Constantine became the emperor. And this is when Nicholas is let out of jail. Then Nicholas goes back to the city of Myra, the port city, and he begins to preach against Diana worship. Now,
against what?
Diana worship. So
the goddess Diana.
The goddess Diana was the most popular Greek god. It was called Artemis in Athens, but Diana was this multi-breasted little Greek idol that they had. It was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. In the temple to Diana at Ephesus, 127 huge pillars and temple prostitutes. So this was the Las Vegas for the Mediterranean. And in Acts chapter 19, the Apostle Paul preaches in Ephesus, and the people all get together and they go, "Oh, great is Diana, the goddess of the Ephesians," and so forth. Well, Nicholas preaches against this goddess Diana, and the people eventually get stirred up and tear down the local temple to Diana, and eventually the big one in Ephesus. And so he was sort of a fire and brimstone type of preacher. And then there was the Arian heresy. So Constantine, the emperor, legalizes Christianity in 313 AD. And then a guy named Arius started this heresy saying Jesus was a little less than God. And he wrote a catchy little song, and a lot of the Visigoths, who were a tribe that had immigrated into the Roman Empire, they embraced Arianism, and it began to split the Roman Empire.
Well, this is a big deal in Christian history, isn't it?
Yeah, this is the mother of all heresies. This is like the first church split. And so Constantine, the Roman emperor, orders all the bishops to go to Nicaea and settle this thing. And they do, they come up with the Nicene Creed. But tradition has it that Nicholas was at that conference because Nicaea was close to Myra. And he was so upset, he slapped Arius across the face for starting the Arian heresy. So jolly old St. Nick had a little temper, right? You better watch out if he's coming to town. And so then there was other instances, and he was involved in them. The Greeks passed down lots of stories and legends and miracles. Some are more believable than others, but some of the popular ones was a corrupt governor was about to have executed a soldier and sort of blame him for some corruption. And Nicholas heard about it, goes down to the execution and breaks through the crowd, grabs the sword out of the executioner's hand, throws it down, and then he turns and he reads the riot act to the governor, starts telling everybody his mail, you know, what he really did in secret. And the governor all of a sudden realizes nobody could have known this stuff except God, so he falls on his knees and he begs Nicholas to pray that God have mercy on his soul. Another story was that there was a famine, and ships full of grain would come from North Africa on their way to the Roman Empire, but they would stop off at Myra. Nicholas went down and talked the sailors into unloading some of the grain to help the starving people. And the sailor said, well, we can't do this. And he promised them that what they had left would multiply. And sure enough, it did. And that was the story, sort of like the Elijah and the widow that had the meal barrel that didn't run dry. And then there was a storm, and the fishermen couldn't get back, and they were afraid they were all going to drown. So they get Nicholas, he goes down and prays, and the sea becomes calm, sort of like Jesus calming the sea. So these are the stories that were passed down. But he dies in 343 AD on December 6th. And so all this is in the book. There really is a Santa Claus, and I have lots of extra details. Justinian, the Roman emperor, who was the head of the state and the head of the church, more or less, Justinian builds a big cathedral, names it after Nicholas. That's how popular he was. And then an interesting thing, in 988 AD, Vladimir the Great, the emperor of Russia, decides to convert to a monotheistic religion. Some Muslims send ambassadors to Vladimir. And the first chronicle, the first court document, the records of the court of Russia, says that Vladimir listened intently while the Muslims were telling them that paradise was filled full of virgins that would fulfill all his desires, because Vladimir was very fond of women. Mm-hmm. And then it goes on to say that when the Muslims told him he could no longer drink, alcohol.
To a Russian, no less.
Yeah, Vladimir said, we cannot have this because drink is the joy of the Russes, the Russians. So it's sort of interesting that Russia did not convert to Islam because Vladimir liked to drink. Anyway, the Jews sent ambassadors, the Khazars, and then the Catholics from Western Europe, but it was the Greeks that sent ambassadors. And at the time, Constantinople had the largest church in the world, Hagia Sophia. And they spoke Greek, the language of the New Testament. And so they presented the Greek Orthodox faith to Vladimir. He converts, and he adopts Nicholas as the patron saint of Russia. That's why just about every town in Russia had a St. Nicholas church, or Nikolai, and the Tsar's Nicholas, and so forth. And then the Muslims invade Asia Minor. And so there were 3 springs. I did a whole book on the history of Islam. And the first Arab Spring, the Muslims conquered from Arabia to Paris. People forget all of what is Morocco, Algiers, Tunisia, Libya, and Egypt, that all used to be Christian for centuries. Mm-hmm. And then Syria used to be Christian. And anyway, so the first wave, the first spring, went from Arabia to Paris. And then there was the Turkish Spring, and the Muslim Turks conquer the Mediterranean, and they invade the Byzantine Empire. Now there's a third spring now with the Muslim Brotherhood. But the second one, when the Muslims invaded what is today Turkey, they would turn churches into mosques, take the boys from the Christian families, force them to become Muslim soldiers to fight the next Christian city, but they would dig up the bones of the Christian saints and give them to the dogs. And so the Christians had their famous Saint Nicholas, and in the year 1087, they moved his bones from Myra over to Bari, Italy, a little town on the southeast coast, Bari, Bari. They built a cathedral there. It's called Cattedrale Nicolo de Bari, Cathedral of Nicholas of Bari. And so this is when the St. Nicholas traditions were introduced to Western Europe and all the gift giving. And
so none of that had occurred in Europe up till, the 11th century we're talking about.
Right, so St. Nicholas was a Greek Orthodox saint. He is the most popular Greek Orthodox saint. There are more churches named after him than almost anybody else.
Well, we have one right here in St. Louis,
right.
too. St. Nicholas Orthodox Church.
And so, anyway, for example, on Cyprus, they had their great, big, huge St. Nicholas Cathedral. And the Muslims invade under Lala Mustafa Pasha. He kills 10,000 of them and turns this into the Lala Mustafa Pasha Mosque. And so they would turn these churches. Anyway, so St. Nicholas's bones are moved to Italy in the year 1087. And all the gift giving becomes very popular. So much so that an Italian St. Francis of Assisi decides to come up with a creche scene, the nativity scene, saying, look, all this gift giving's fine, but we need to get back to the reason for the season. Jesus was born in a manger. So if you see the manger scene, that goes back to St. Francis of Assisi. Then the Reformation starts in Germany. Martin Luther ends the saints' days, but the people in Germany liked the gift giving so much, he moves it all to December 25th and said, all gifts come from the Christ child. And the German word for Christ child was Christkindl. And so even to this day, on Christmas Eve, the German families go, oh, Christkindl's coming, Christkindl's coming. Well, that morphed into Kris Kringle, right? And it was also Martin Luther's walking home and sees the stars twinkling and puts a tree up and puts candles in the branches and says, this is like the sky above Bethlehem on the night of Christ's birth, and that turned into what we have as a Christmas tree. But then there's England. And how am I doing time-wise? Is this interesting?
You've got plenty. Yeah.
And again, this is all in the book. There really is a Santa Claus, the history of St. Nicholas. And so England had Henry VIII. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, who sent Columbus to America. Mm-hmm. And Catherine did not have a son after 18 years, so Henry VIII decides to divorce her. The Pope would not recognize the divorce. Henry VIII said, well, I'll be my own Pope. He starts the Church of England, puts himself as the head, goes on to have 6 wives, and he decides to end the saints' days in England, and he sort of brought back an end-of-the-year holiday called Saturnalia, right? Britain used to be a Roman colony. Julius Caesar invaded Britain, right? And so Saturn was their god of feasting and plenty and merriment. At the end of the year, they would give gifts and sort of party, and so during this time in England, Christmas became sort of a Mardi Gras, right? Now, you think, Mardi Gras, what's that? Well, Mardi Gras was actually a religious day. It was the last day before you would fast for 40 days before Easter. But now it's turned into this lewd party in New Orleans. Well, that's sort of what happened to Christmas under Henry VIII. It became sort of a drinking, partying, carousing type of thing. And this Saturn was sort of Christianized and called Father Christmas. In other words, if you've seen The Christmas Carol with Charles Dickens, and there's the spirit of Christmas past, present, future. Well, the spirit of Christmas present is what? It's this big, happy party guy. He's got wreath in his hair, a goblet of wine, grapes all around, sort of the ho-ho happy.
Right.
And you're asking yourself, who is this guy? He sort of looks like Santa Claus, but he also sort of looks like a Roman god. Well, that's who he was. He was Saturn, but they Christianized him, called him Father Christmas. They couldn't call him St. Nicholas because saints were outlawed. And so it was during this time in England that Christmas was this wassailing and partying and so forth. And then the Puritans took over England. And 1640.
Out goes the party.
And they stopped the partying. They outlawed Christmas. They were really dry. And it was the Puritans that settled America. And in Massachusetts, these Puritans had a 5-shilling fine for anyone caught celebrating Christmas. They said the Sabbath is our holy day and all the rest of the days are the same. Matter of fact, when the Pilgrims landed, they landed on November of 1620, but by December 25th, the captain of the Mayflower of the ship, named Christopher West, he's writing in his ship's log. He says, "At harbor Christmas Day at Plymouth, but not observed by these colonists, they being opposed to all saints' days, etc. A large party went ashore to fell timber to build their first church, their first building." Mm-hmm. And so it's sort of interesting. The next year, another boatload of pilgrims come over, and they wanted to observe Christmas. And William Bradford, who was really into tolerance and not wanting to force people's consciences, he says, well, we went out to work and we came back at lunchtime and these new pilgrims were playing stickball in the street and kickball and so forth. And he said, it may offend your conscience to have to work on Christmas, but it offends our conscience that you're playing while we're working. So if you're going to observe Christmas, do it quietly in your homes. Anyway, it was not until the Dutch settled New Amsterdam that the Dutch brought over their St. Nicholas traditions. Now, if we look at the Dutch, the Christmas theme was biblical. In other words, Jesus would return at the end of the world to judge the living and the dead, riding a white horse. And the saints would come back with him riding white horses. And St. Nicholas is a saint, so he would come back sort of once a year to do a little mini checkup. But in Norway, they didn't have horses, so he's coming on reindeer. And then there's the Lamb's Book of Life and the Book of Works, and the angels would keep this, and you're judged according to what's in the books. Well, that turns into the elves keeping the book of the naughty and the nice instead of the angels. And then the saints would come from the North Pole, right? I mean, they would come from heaven, the celestial city. Well, that turned into the North Pole. And so we see these biblical stories were actually sort of, morphed a little bit. And matter of fact, it's interesting. In Holland, to this day, they have St. Nicholas coming from Spain once a year, and he would be riding a white horse, but he's dressed as a bishop with his mitred hat, his staff, and he would have with him a Moorish costumed helper, Zwarte Piet. And the Moors were the Muslims. And they had slavery for 700 years in Spain. And they would take the slaves from Spain and Portugal and the Mediterranean to North Africa. There were whole Catholic orders in Europe during the Middle Ages called the Trinitarians. The head of the order was called the ransomer. And they would collect alms and donations and go under a white flag to North Africa to get your friend back who was captured by these Muslim slave traders. And anyway, so St. Nicholas would come and give presents. But if the boy was naughty, they would tell him that Zwarte Piet, this Moorish costumed helper, would take the naughty boy and put him in a gunny sack and take him back to Spain and sell him into Muslim slavery. And so often when you would tell a little boy that Santa's coming, he would start crying.
Yeah.
Instead of being happy for presents, he'd start crying because he thought it might be his last night on earth. And so I was doing a radio interview and it was a call-in, and someone called in and said, yeah, I was raised over there in Europe, and every Christmas Eve, all the little boys would make sure to have pocket knives in their pockets.
To cut out of the sack.
Yeah, I said, why is that? He goes, that's to cut ourselves out of the gunny sack in case Zwarte Piet took us.
Now, what's the deal with the tree?
Well,
I mean, there's, as you know, there has been recent discussion about Christmas tree versus holiday tree. Where did this tradition come from? Then it said something about Germany.
Right, well, the tree is interesting. The lights come from Hanukkah. All right, the Jewish festival of lights, and that's at the end of the year. The tree actually goes back to Winfred or Saint Boniface, who chops down the tree that the Thor was supposed to be in, and the Germans would worship Thor and sacrifice people to this god that lived in the tree. And so Saint Boniface chopped it down and said, he saw a little evergreen tree and it was pointing up. He says, this is a tree of peace. It's evergreen. It doesn't die. And your homes are built to this. And so let this be the tree of the Christ child. And then it was Martin Luther that takes the Hanukkah lights more or less and then the tree and puts them together. But there is an interesting part of the Dutch bringing Santa Claus to New York. The Dutch liked St. Nicholas, and the ship that was built that the first Dutch settlers came over was named St. Nicholas ship. They didn't want to put a Poseidon or a naked lady on the front of Mermaid. They put a picture of St. Nicholas. And so when they came to New York, these Dutch built a church. The first church built in New York City was St. Nicholas Dutch Reformed Church. It was there until at 5th Avenue and 48th Street until 1949 when they sold it to build an oil building, you know. But it was the largest Protestant church in North America, St. Nicholas Church. Anyway, so these Dutch settled New Amsterdam, which became New York. Yeah. The Dutch pronounced St. Nicholas Sant Nicolaas, or Santa Claus. So Santa Claus is the Dutch pronunciation of St. Nicholas. Now, in New York was where you had Washington Irving. Now, he was the most famous writer in America in the early 1800s. He gave us Rip Van Winkle, Legend of Sleepy Hollow. He actually wrote a book on Muhammad, talked about how he switched from being nice like Jesus, and then he took up the sword. But he became U.S. Minister to Spain. Washington Irving wrote Dietrich Knickerbocker's History of New York from the Dutch founding to the end of the Dutch dynasty. And in his book, Washington Irving writes how now St. Nicholas visits us once a year, riding in his wagon over the treetops, throwing out presents to his favorites. Still calls him St. Nicholas, but describes him dressed not as a bishop like in Holland, but in a typical Dutch outfit of long trunk hose, leather belt, boots, and a stocking hat. And then in the around 1840s in New York was a Clement Moore, a Hebrew professor, Anglican, and he wrote a story for his children called A Visit from Saint Nicholas. But now he describes him with a little Dutch outfit, but shrunk in size. A right jolly old elf. I laughed when I saw him in spite of myself. A round, broad little face and a round little belly that shook when he laughed like a bowl full of jelly. The stump of a pipe he held tight in his teeth, and the smoke encircled his head like a wreath. So somewhere he took up tobacco. I don't know where that came from, the American Indians.
I was going to say, yeah, that from Virginia.
And anyway, then we have the Civil War, and there was a illustrator for Harper's Weekly magazine named Thomas Nast, and he's the one who gave us the Republican elephant and the Democrat mule, right? And so Thomas Nast did a series of illustrations with St. Nicholas with the Union troops, and in the background is the first North Pole sign. So prior to that, St. Nicholas came from heaven, the celestial city, right? And now it's the North Pole. So this was sort of a political jab at the South during the Civil War to say St. Nicholas is associated with the North. And then there was Coca-Cola, and they, in the 1930s, had an artist named Haddon Sundblom who did a painting of St. Nicholas drinking Coca-Cola. He did it every year for 30 years, another painting. And Coca-Cola invented mass marketing. It's the best known trademark name in the world. And so they promoted this. Now St. Nicholas has grown in size, right? Now he's got the ruddy complexion, the rosy cheeks, is a happy, huggable grandfather type guy. And what I do in the book is I remind people that Santa Claus today can be traced all the way back to St. Nicholas.
From what?
He died in 343 AD.
343.
And he was somebody who loved Jesus, right? He was a Christian. He was imprisoned under the Roman Emperor Diocletian for his Christian faith, so he was a genuine Christian. He was against this sexual immorality of Diana worship, so he would have been a fire and brimstone preacher. He was against the Arian heresy, right? So he stood up for Bible doctrine and slapped Arius there. And then he was generous, gave to the poor, and wanted to do it anonymously so the glory would go to God. And so the original guy is someone who can, and he's a saint, so he's still alive in heaven, right? And so he's still there. And it's just an interesting story that is on St. Nicholas. And then in the book, I have all the other holiday traditions, like the 12 days of Christmas.
Well, let me ask you, in the last, we got about 3 minutes left here, a little more. What do you make of here in the early part of the 21st century, this movement away from all the what you're just talking about, away from the Christian Christmas to some holiday party?
Well, you know, it's interesting. The word holiday comes from holy day. And what were the holy days? Well, in Eastern Europe, January 6th, Epiphany, the visit of the wise men, was the holiest day. In Western Europe, December 25th, Christmas was the holiest day, and they couldn't decide, so at the Council of Tours in 567 AD, they decided to make all 12 days from December 25th to January 6th, the 12 days of Christmas. Right? So it's not 12 days leading up to Christmas, it's 12 days between December 25th and January 6th. And they decided to call them all holy days, which we pronounce today as holidays. And so they call it a holiday tree. It's a holy day tree. Well, what's the holy day? The holy days are the days of Christmas.
Well, that's what I couldn't figure out. I mean, I'm sure you heard not long ago that the governor of Rhode Island wouldn't call the Christmas tree a Christmas tree. It's a holiday tree. And I'm like, well, what holiday is that?
Well, here's an interesting little bit of trivia for you. Clovis, the king of France, got baptized on Christmas Day, 496 AD. That's where we get the name Clovis turns into Lovis or Louis. And so all 23 kings of France were named Louis, and St. Louis, Missouri is named after St. Louis. So that goes back to Clovis, who was baptized on Christmas Day, 496 AD. But then we see that Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperor, got crowned on Christmas Day in 800 AD. But then St. Stephen of Hungary got crowned king on Christmas Day in the year 1000. Now, St. Stephen of Hungary had a son named Emmerich, who became a saint. And there was an Italian named after St. Emmerich. And this Italian was named Amerigo, which is the Italianized version of Emmerich. So Emmerich, Amerigo, right? So St. Emmerich, Hungarian saint, the Italian spelling Amerigo. Well, this person's name was Amerigo Vespucci. He was a map maker explorer. He's the first one to suggest that the world that Columbus had discovered was not part of China and India. It was actually a whole new continent that ended up getting named on the map America.
For him.
So America is from Amerigo, which is from Emmerich, which is the son of the St. Stephen, who was crowned king on Christmas Day. So we have America connected with Christmas Day. And just a fascinating history that we can't get away from. It's part of our entire heritage. And the book, There Really Is a Santa Claus.
Thank you very much. I don't understand what's going on with Christmas in terms of people trying to de-Christianize it, but it's happening. I want to thank you very much, Bill Federer, for being with us today and spending so much time informing us about the history of Christmas.
Thank you, Lee.
You're very welcome. And to my audience, I just want to let you know that Bill Federer is available on the internet. You ought to look him up and perhaps get his once daily emails. To all the rest of you, we'll see you next time and on YouTube. Thanks. Bye.